Alan Ohashi is a Silver Sage member here in Boulder, Colorado. Here, I say, because we live across the street from each other in different co-housing communities. He is a member on the board of directors for the association, and in fact is in a secretary role for the association right now, super helpful. And he has been a presenter at multiple conferences and actually speaks to smaller groups around the city and the region as well. He's going to be speaking to us tonight. What are you talking about tonight, Alan? Difficult people?
We're talking about facilitating through difficult situations. And as Karen mentioned, I'm Alan Ohashi. I live across the street from her community, which is Wild Sage. I live in Silver Sage, Boulder, Colorado. I'm a cultural competency trainer and facilitator, and I've worked with a wide variety of organizations, government agencies, private, nonprofit, and for-profit organizations, and I've been doing that for the past 30 years. Lately, I mostly do this for fun and personal satisfaction, but have found that there's kind of a niche for my approach in the intentional community market, and basically I'll give this pitch and modifications thereof to pretty much anyone who will want to hear about it. In my past nonprofit life, I worked in two kind of diametrically opposite fields. One was positive youth development, and the other was domestic violence prevention. Worked in nonprofit organizations in Denver. And I ended up melding the two disciplines together. And over time, I've kind of honed this hybrid set of facilitation skills that I find works better for consensus-based meetings, consensus-based organizations such as Cohousing. And so, you know, what's the difference? You know, facilitation is facilitation, right? Well, facilitating in a consensus-based and lay environment, you know, you have that in co-housing. It's way different than for traditional organizations, including regular homeowners associations. I imagine most of you are in HOAs. And generally, HOAs are these top-down, centralized decision-making organizations. They have voting, one by one, limited participation from the constituents. Individual in your workplace, you have the same situation. Individual bosses are empowered to make unilateral decisions. They may seek input from others, but for the most part, the ultimate authority resides at the top. You know, the buck stops here, if you know about Harry Truman. In consensus-based co-housing, members generally come from different walks of life, different experiences, different work environments. They participated in community in different ways. And generally speaking, outside of co-housing or outside of consensus communities, the interactions are very, what I call, transactional. What I mean by transactional is that, you know, I ask you to do task A, and then you get Y in return. So for instance, I ask you to do a job, and then you get paid. And so there's a transaction that happens. Or you study hard in school, and you get a good grade. So there's that transaction that happens for doing X, and you get Y. And so most of our lives, we've been kind of going through this transactional socialization process, and ever since we've been young, you know, you eat your spinach or no TV, and that sort of transactional behavior is reinforced through college and eventually into the workplace. And in co-housing, decision making is trying to put that square peg based on transactions. I can do what I want into a round hole, that transformational round hole. Now, you can do what you want, but as long as everyone else goes along with what you want to do. So there are those tapes that we have to kind of rewind in our head. In consensus-based organizations, I consider to be more transformational, in that leadership is shared with one another. There are high levels of input from everybody. In particular, there's a high level of attention paid to minority positions or the dissenting opinion. Let's see here, my notes. All right, as we were just talking about, unwinding those transactional top-down orientations is a tough behavior to change. And you'll find yourself lapsing into, I make a motion that we do this, and I second it, and it's just sort of part of the common vernacular of day-to-day life or transactions. And so when you could once paint your house whatever color you wanted, if you lived in a basic subdivision or in a single family house and you decide you want to live in co-housing, all of a sudden in co-housing, your neighbors not only want to know what color it is, but they want to know whether or not you're using latex or enamel. And so there are all these sort of complications that happen as a result of transformational organizations. So that's some kind of basic background on what makes facilitating in a consensus-based community a little bit different than facilitating in more of a transactional organization. And so, well, there are probably lots of ways to go about what I'm going to be talking about here. And if you decide that you're going to adopt any of my ideas and suggestions, feel free to add your own secret sauces and approaches that are, sort of based on your own experiences. So what I'll go do here is go over some tactics that I like to follow. I'm giving you some trade secrets, actually. I just don't really like to give up this kind of information much, but you can't take it with you, right? So anyway, I'll go through a few tactics that I employ when I facilitate, and then we can hear your war stories and have a discussion. And as Karen mentioned, you can leave your questions in the chat box, and we will just get started. So I'm going to kind of mix together high tech and low tech, because usually when you facilitate, you use flip charts or some kind of hard copy. So the first thing that I want to talk about, you can see this, is to set boundaries. And what I mean by that is communities usually have sort of established values and codes of conduct. I think everyone on their websites probably have your vision and values for your organization. And I like to get those who are attending a meeting to agree and reaffirm their agreement, follow their mission and their vision and values. And how I do that is I start out with renaming norms and expectations. And so on a piece of poster board, I write, all right, we're going to be talking about some things we're going to be governing us tonight in our own little community culture. And some of these are really basic, like be nice, listen, challenge by choice. What else do we have here? A very important one is empower the heart keeper, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the biggest one is finish on time. So I'll digress here a moment and say that when I facilitate, I use two different colors of pen, because you want to be able to make your notes so that people will be able to read them from the back of the room. And in addition to two different colors, I use colors that really stand out. And I use black and red because they're the ones that are the most prominent, and it can be more easily seen. And I must say that I cringe whenever I have to use black and red, because those are the team colors of the opposing high school in my town, and so I would much rather use blue and black, but blue doesn't show up very well. So anyway, set boundaries by getting everyone to agree with norms and expectations. So what I do is I ask the room if there are any objections to those. In my experience, there really hasn't been, but if there are, I would take the time and find out, what it would take for them, the dissenters, to agree, and ask again if everyone objects. And I ask for objections for everything really 3 times, and we'll go over that in a little bit. about any decision. So what does this do? Why is this important? It's important because it makes it okay for the facilitator and others in the room to correct behavior. Since the norms and expectations are agreed upon among all the people in the room, even though they've agreed to them before and their broad-based missions and visions and values, everyone agrees to these. And so when someone calls out another for cross-talking, or not paying attention, or talking out of turn, or whatever your norms and expectations are, it will not be viewed as bullying. It will not be viewed as aggressive behavior because everyone has agreed to that norm. And the people who are maybe the crosstalkers will agree that they should be held in line by their peers. So the second thing is empower the heart keeper. What's the heart keeper, you might add? Or you might ask. Well, at Silver Sage Village, we have a heart keeper. And in, I guess, common vernacular and transactional vernacular, that would be known as the sergeant at arms. And in parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order, it's a throwback to early times in merry old England. And back then, there actually was a person who was a sergeant, and they would be wielding a mace. And they would use that as sort of a way to keep order. And so what our heart keeper has is not a mace, but a stuffed heart. It's out in the hallway, I should grab it. But anyway, we have a stuffed heart and a chime, ding, to ring whenever there needs to be something brought to the meeting's attention. Now, this is another thing. I always verbalize that, the empowering the heart keeper in the norms and expectations. And because the heart keeper is then empowered to help keep the meeting moving, just like a sergeant at arms. I asked the heart keeper if they're up to doing the task. It's not, you have to be pretty forthright to, stop a meeting or hold someone accountable. And it's like that, when you sit in those the seats in the airplane with the more leg room, the flight attendant comes over and says, do you have the ability and the strength to rip that door out if you need to? Well, I always ask the heart keeper whether or not they have what it's going to take to, be the heart keeper in the meeting. Because it's really something, the person who is sort of the assistant facilitator, if you will, or the person who helps keep the order. So it's very important. And, you're going to find that not everybody is a really good heart keeper. So, it's the nice person who doesn't ever make waves and sits in the back and everyone likes them. That person may not be the best heart keeper. It could be someone who is a little bit more forthright. And so you'll get a feel for who the good heart keepers are. One time, this is a war story. One time I remember I was facilitating a meeting, and the topic got a little off track. I started losing control of the crowd. There's lots of cross-talking that was happening, and needed some help. And I could have stood up and yelled something or be quiet or whatever. But the heart keeper stepped up, rang the bell, and stopped the meeting. Everybody took a few moments to breathe, and the reason that this worked so well is because the heart keeper was empowered. The heart keeper did not feel like they were going to be put down or called out because they helped take control of the meeting. So having a heart keeper is a very important aspect, at least from my view. Third thing is space management. And what do I mean by space management? I'd say that most co-housing groups, probably facilitate in a circle. Do you all have circles as opposed to sitting in a church-like setting? Yeah. Well, anyway, as a facilitator, I sit at the same level with the rest of the group. In a transactional meeting, I stand because transactional groups are more accustomed to having a leader running the meeting and someone sort of lording over and displaying authority. In co-housing, I like to emulate the flat structure and facilitate kind of from the ground level. And so what that it does is it sort of disarms the meeting. It keeps the meeting so that there is still that notion of consensus and kind of flat leadership. The other thing I think is important too is as opposed to facilitating with a lot of voice, I like to facilitate using body language. In a transactional facilitation, the facilitator is empowered to rule with an iron fist and get the meeting going forward and moving along and getting people to make decisions and pushing the process. And in transformational facilitation, such as in a consensus community in co-housing, iron-handed meeting control is kind of a turnoff, and it really forces the facilitator to be part of the chaos, because as I mentioned before, you know, it's like herding cats in community meetings, and because people are just not attuned to sitting down and coming to a decision based on, you know, putting a round peg in the square peg in the round hole approach. And so what do I do with when I facilitate and there is something that needs to be corrected? Since I'm sitting, the first move that I do is to stand up, and that generally gets the group's attention. And then I'll stand up like when I have to point when I'm changing an agenda item or moving on to something else, or if there are crosstalkers. Nobody likes to be told what to do. I don't care what organization you're in or what meeting that you're sitting. No one likes to be told what to do. And so I like to give people a chance to self-correct themselves. And so if there are crosstalkers, for example, this happens a lot in meetings. When I stand up, I'll continue to facilitate, but I'll take a couple steps towards the crosstalkers. And I won't correct them. I won't tell them to be quiet. When they see a person walking towards them, they generally get the idea that it's time for them to pay attention. And that pretty much stops the chatting. And then I make my way back to my seat or get back to whatever is the business that happens to be at hand. What about worst case scenarios? I have to tell you that I have had the worst case scenario. And it was in a community meeting. There were heightened tensions between a couple community members. One got up and took a step towards the other from the other side of the room. And my reaction was I physically stepped between the two of them as if they were crosstalkers, and it stopped it. And they went back. And in retrospect, while it worked for crosstalkers, that was potentially dangerous, potentially a little risky. And would I do it again? Yes, I would do it again. And in my case, it wasn't disruptive to the meeting. It really quick. The people returned to their seats and the meeting continued. But in my way of thinking, what the big problem was, after the meeting, there really wasn't any resolution to the conflict and nobody was held accountable. And so in retrospect, it worked out in terms of the meeting, but I think it could have been handled better, you know, community-wise. This was several years ago. But sticks in my mind like it happened yesterday. All right, the fourth thing I'm going to talk about, and last thing I'm going to talk about, is this notion of negative polling as opposed to positive polling. I find it less time consuming to reveal disagreement in a group rather than to confirm agreement. In a transactional meeting or a consensus that uses more positive polling, it'll be something like all those in favor say aye and all those opposed say no. And then there's the counting of the votes, and all that takes time. And in a consensus community, it's always that thumbs up and sideways or thumbs down or whatever. And it's still the same thing where you end up having to spend time counting, and then there are all the discussions about, oh, that person isn't qualified to vote. They voted twice. That household voted twice, and you didn't count me. And let's have a recount. And so you can see how it gets to be a little bit time consuming. And so the idea behind consensus is because there is no counting, decisions are always generally 100% approval in some way, shape, or form. And so the idea of negative polling is that you would find out what the dissenters want. What's on the dissenters, what are on the dissenters' mind? And so what I say after a discussion, I say something like, well, sensing that there's no further discussion and we're ready to come to consensus, is there anyone who thinks that's a totally bad idea? Is there anyone who strongly objects to this? Is there anyone who wants to stop this from happening? And so the idea is to get the people who are the blockers. Those are the people who you are most concerned about. And in consensus community, consensus decision making, it really errs towards to the dissenters, gives the minorities, it gives the minority opinion more, not really more weight, but weight to be a way to be recognized. And so people who are, you know, the fence sitters, the ones that want to stand aside, or the ones that can live with it, you know, those are people you are approving it. People who you really want to deal with are the people who absolutely don't want to see this thing happen. And so when you use the negative polling, it makes the counting easier, and it makes the decision making faster. And so then what I say is, hearing no objections, it is the consensus of the community to approve this action. And again, my liturgy is to ask for objections 3 times. I'll say, does anyone object? Do you want to stop this from going forward? Is this a terrible idea? And hearing none, the action is approved. And so I always give credit for this technique to my very first boss, who was named Mike Enzi. At that time, he was mayor of Gillette, Wyoming, and my very first boss back in the dark ages. And, you know, he's kept at it and is now the senior US Senator from Wyoming. And you see him sometimes standing over Donald Trump's shoulders, but he was my very first mentor. All right, well, that's all I have for, you know, kind of a prepared presentation. And so we got like, what, 20 minutes or so to have some discussion, open discussion, and hear your war stories. What do you got out there?
So if you have a question or want to bring something up, you should be able to unmute yourself. Somebody want to test that?
Yeah, I'd like to say something.
There you are.
And I'll get my video up here in a minute. But so the CEO of Microsoft posted something recently in LinkedIn, and I found it very interesting in that he has given all his staff the book on nonviolent communication. And then in LinkedIn, he wrote about this example he used when he was at, say, a cocktail party. And there's those people that just go on talking. And he had, well, in my opinion, kind of a abrupt way to stop the talking. But he can kind of do that because he is the CEO of Microsoft. Alan, I'd love to hear how you deal with those situations when in a group at your co-housing group, and maybe even just social surroundings. How do you deal with people that talk too much?
Well, you know, like I said, that's one of the things that you can do at the very, very beginning of the meeting, which is, you know, share the floor, or don't speak or speak only when recognized. You know, everyone has those people, you know, in high school. You know, there was always that kid who had the answer for everything, every question. He's got an answer for all the questions. And so it's a matter of getting the community to say that that's not appropriate behavior for the meeting. In fact, you know, in our community, we have, I'd say, 1 or 2 of those folks. And again, I'll use that technique and I'll step towards them. And that means for them to share the floor. And so the heart keeper can also intervene in that case. People will get people. You know what happens is people start getting the message, and they start understanding that you know, it's better to not tell your life story on every single issue.
Thank you.
I think, Alan, Judy Slater. Judy, if you want to speak up. So I believe your question was just back to the situation about after the meeting.
Yeah.
You want to just...
What do you mean by after the meeting?
Well, you were talking about that example that the learning that you didn't think that, I mean, what you did had really resolved it.
I think that, you know, we have since updated our conflict management, conflict resolution, I guess, policy or agreements. And I think we do now have a way of dealing with something like that. And it is more, we have, in fact, we just sort of established a conflict resolution committee. In fact, I don't know if maybe there supposedly were some people from my community who were chiming in on this, and they might have, you know, a different outlook on it. But we do have a process more in place now that would, I guess, enable some sort of not really resolution, but a way for neighbors to, you know, make up or apologize or whatever. But at the time, it was just kind of this open-ended thing.
Well, and that's what my question was. Well, what was the you know, what did you learn and what would you do differently? So it sounds like, you know, having another policy in place when those things happen.
Yeah, I would fall back or tailor your facilitation to whatever your conflict resolution policy happens to be for your community. And in absence, and you know, my word to the wise is figure something out, and so that when that happens, and it's going to happen, you know, it may not get to the point of near fisticuffs, but it's going to come to you'll run into situations where there may be name calling or, you know, that kind of stuff. But you know, I guess one thing could happen is that I could send you what we have come up with, and
that would be great, because we're starting a new community and we're trying to write everything. So we haven't gotten there yet, but that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, and this is one of the great things about Coho USA, and this is one of the things that we offer is that, you know, we have templates for various things, and your Dex and Doc templates, and bylaw templates, and conflict resolution templates, and dog templates, and stuff like that. So, you know, you can lean on the community, on the co-housing community at large, and through the listserv or through some of the Facebook chat rooms and such, and you can, you know, get, you know, quite a bit of good feedback from those places.
Yeah, I know you.
But if you do want to get the copy from Silver Sage, leave your email in the text box, and maybe Karen is taking names.
Okay.
No war stories? No, nothing. No one wants to backtrack anything?
Jean had a question. They were having some problems with the audio at the very beginning. She was just wondering if you could show again the first point 1 and point 2.
Yeah, you know what? You know, the great thing about it's like a teleprompter that I have, and so I can send all my notes that I actually was leaning on to Karen, and you can make those available. But
that's great. Yeah, we'll put those on the co-housing website under web chats. It will be a recording of this web chat as well as any notes that Alan has.
Yeah. First one was to set boundaries. That was through the norms and expectations. Next one was to have a heart keeper and empower them to help control the meeting. And the third thing was space management, how to use body language and get people to self-correct themselves. And then the fourth one was negative polling, how to make the decision-making go faster.
What other questions do people have?
Or other ideas? What are some ideas that you all use?
Well, can you hear me?
You can.
Do you guys all use Fist to 5?
I didn't hear that.
Do you use Fist to 5?
Fist to 5.
He's already talking to somebody else. I want to speak to him.
Okay, shall I give a quick explanation?
Sure.
Fist to 5 is, let me see here. All right. Hi, my name is Rick. Fist to 5 is a way to assess the situation. You know, once you get a proposal and write up a specific, you know, sentence or two or whatever the proposal is, you call for Fist to 5. And the idea is if you fully support it, you hold up 5 fingers, or 4, or 3, or 2, or 1, or block it. When we get the blocks, the 1s and the 2s, we listen to their input. And my preference is not to ask or talk about what's wrong, because people can get mad if you say something's wrong about their idea. Just identify what's missing. And if you can identify what's missing for the people that have a block and 1s and 2s, then you modify the proposal to include what's missing for them. And also by identifying what's missing, you're kind of like halfway there to like figuring out what's needed for people that find some interest that's missing. So Fist to 5 is a quick tool to assess what's going on in the room instead of having a 2-hour conversation about what everybody thinks about some issue, or a 30-minute discussion.
Right. That's a good way. That's a good idea. And so that's worked successful in your community. I think we tend to use more of a free form approach, hear everybody out, and then pretty soon, as facilitator, you can kind of figure out, okay, where the discussion's starting to get a little redundant and we're repeating ourselves. That's when the facilitator, when I would, start to curtail the discussion and ask if we're ready to move on. And if there still is more discussion, then we'll continue to have more discussion. And eventually the conversation will, sort of dwindle. But I do like that. I do like that that kind of straw poll approach. It's a good way to get to the end quick as well.
It's Francis Decker. Can you hear me?
I can.
I was just wondering, I just wanted to say, we had an externally facilitated meeting here at Pacific Gardens in Nanaimo. And one of the techniques that they used was to give us all a purple card, 2 of them actually. And when we were about to have a consensus discussion, we had to spend our cards to get a turn to speak. So that meant that the big talkers would only get 2 shots, and then they couldn't speak anymore until everyone had had a chance. It makes you think, how do I want to spend my card? Thank you.
Alan, do you have any comments about that method? Is he frozen? Alan?
I left for a moment. And so I didn't hear the rest of that question.
She was actually explaining about a facilitator that they had, and everybody was given 2 cards, like purple index cards, and it was like money, right? So you could spend it to say something. And it sounds like the concept is that it really made you think about what you were going to say because you only had 2 opportunities. Did I sum that up correctly?
Great.
Yeah, that wasn't for, was that when that was for a regular business meeting or just for something special?
So,
I think anytime you are going to do popcorn as opposed to a round, it's a way of calming the popcorn. And the other thing we did at the same time was we did reflective listening. So somebody would make a statement and then I would ask somebody else in the group to reflectively listen. And then, so everybody felt heard before the next point was made. It slowed the meeting down and people had to be more thoughtful. But I would say when you're gonna do popcorn, that's the way to do it.
Right. So was that for a regular business meeting or was that
It was a community meeting. It was a special meeting.
just a regular meeting?
In a sense, we meet monthly and it was our monthly meeting. So in that sense, but in the other case, we did have a guideline being presented on clean air. And it had been a contentious issue. So there was nervousness in the community and it needed to be well facilitated and controlled. But at the same time, it needed to be free and inclusive and open. You have to try and get both, right?
Right. And that, again, this is where if you take that extra step and establish norms and expectations at the very beginning, get everyone to agree to kind of where the bars and what the box is, then that helps, keeps a lot of the noise from becoming too much of the conversation.
So in this particular meeting, we used the consensus decision-making process, step 5, and I outlined what we were doing in this part of the discussion.
Right.
So that was a way of setting the boundaries.
Right.
Anyway, it was really, I think it really worked.
Yeah, it was great. Unmute now.
and then there's, Alan, there's a note from Diane. You had asked just kind of what other people's experiences or communities have been doing. And they said that for years that the community has been using co-facilitators to plan and manage meetings. So do you want to maybe talk about having 2 facilitators versus 1 and what that might,
Yeah, 2 facilitators is kind of like have you ever been to a live auction and they have spotters? There's the guy who's the auctioneer and there's spotters. Well, that's a good way to kind of, one person, particularly if you can work well together, one person can be in charge of kind of keeping a stack of people who want to talk, and the other person can do the facilitation, and that role can kind of switch off. The other facilitator can play the role of the heart keeper. There are a lot of advantages. There are total advantages to having 2 people helping facilitate a meeting. And it's just a matter of the facilitators not sort of cross-facilitating, or one facilitator saying, do it like this, and the other one says, no, do it like this. They really need to work as a team and understand their roles when doing a team facilitation. But I think it's a great idea to have 2 people. In our case, we have the heart keeper as being sort of the co-facilitator. Occasionally, we'll have someone who will want to, be kind of the guy who keeps the stack of a speaking order.
So from that same person, they said they did co-facilitation to help more members build their skills, and several of us formed a facilitation team to coach ourselves to debrief post meetings and improve upon meetings in the future.
Right, yeah, that's a good idea. In fact, we always have kind of an meeting assessment at the end of all of our team meetings, as well as community meetings. How did it go? Do you have any, any feedback to the facilitator or to the heart keeper or whatever. So yeah, that's a really good practice. But what we don't do is have a intentional, I guess, working of facilitators together. We tend to have maybe all communities have this. We tend to have the same 4 or 5 people who tend to be the facilitators. And it's a skill, and some people it's not something, they'd rather pull weeds than be a meeting facilitator, and so not everyone is cut out for it.
Could I ask a question?
You may.
What would you do in a situation where in the middle of the meeting or before the meeting it becomes clear that the 2 facilitators are and I was one of the 2 facilitators, are too emotionally caught up in the meeting topic, so that I wasn't able to, and the other facilitator wasn't able to be as effective as we might have been, because we were sort of involved in this conflict and it really sort of blew up in the meeting and we didn't anticipate that. What might you have done in that?
Well, you're kind of cutting out, but the gist of what I got was when you have a facilitator or co-facilitators and one or both are engaged in the topic or engaged in the discussion, how do you manage that? Well, in the one of my war stories, I was facilitating, and I also happened to be the topic of the discussion of the particular item. People were trying to draw me into the discussion. You got to give your perspective on this. You got to tell your point of view on this. And I had resisted doing that. And I actually did resist all the way through to the end, because I was confident that going around the room, I was going to find a solution to the issue that I happened to be in the middle. And so that was one where, it caused all the cross-talking, and the heart keeper stepped up. But thinking back on that, I should have, or what I could have done, even it did have a good resolution, because I really kind of stuck to my guns and didn't allow myself to get baited. But what I could have done, in fact, others in our community do when they're facilitating, is they will hand the facilitation duties off to somebody else. And say, in fact, thinking about it now, I usually have sort of a person picked out who I'm going to ask to facilitate temporarily while I participate in the discussion. And so that's something that I didn't mention that should be set up ahead of time. If you're facilitating, kind of find somebody who would be your co-facilitator if you as a facilitator need to take yourself out of the facilitation role and into a community member role.
Okay. I think the problem is that neither of us recognized it in the moment, or were able to, to get ourselves out of the situation. It was a very difficult community meeting, and we had to set up.
Yeah, those are tough ones, because you just, you take all the aggressive communication classes, the nonviolent communication classes, and the mirroring of discussions and all that, and everyone, but only when the time comes to actually use the skill, it happens so fast. It's unless it comes second nature to you, it's really hard to engage. And so there's nothing wrong with kind of feeling like a deer in the headlights when you're doing facilitation. In fact, it's just one of those things where it just kind of takes practice and then, in fact, practice being stuck in difficult facilitation situations. And luckily, I look at it as luckily I have been in lots of difficult facilitation situations, because it just gives me better chops and more experience, and what it really feels like having to think on your feet and come to it and make a reaction to keep the meeting moving forward. So I really do like to have difficult facilitations that happen from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think the outcome for us as a community was that we realized we needed more facilitators, because we were down to just 2 or 3 of us, and that wasn't enough to handle when 2 or 3 of us were caught up emotionally in an issue.
Right.
Alan, I have a question kind of related to that. Have you had experience Or would you suggest that in a situation like that, where a community is dealing with a challenging situation and the people that are typically their facilitators are too far into it to feel like they can effectively facilitate a meeting, rather than, you know, hiring a professional facilitator, what about resourcing another community? If there's a nearby co-housing community that understands co-housing meetings and could facilitate, but from a outside, non-related
Right.
capacity.
Yeah, I'd say that's in bounds. We've used facilitators to help from Nyland Co-housing. There's a guy named Greg over there. He's a facilitator. He's come and done some work at Silver Sage, and so I think that's totally in bounds. You know, it's, you know, familiarity breeds contempt, and so, you know, you can get too close to issues or you lose credibility. And me in in sort of this consulting business that I do, you know, it's that rule of 500 miles, right? If you live 500 miles away or farther from your where you're doing your work, you know, you have more credibility than if you are in the community itself.
Mm.
And so I just happened to be at this one, visiting this one community maybe 2 Januaries ago, and they were going through an issue about, you know, you have those people who are the what do you call them, the perpetual control freaks, and the people that want to be involved with every single thing, and everyone want to have their fingers in every pie. Well, anyway, it caused a disruption in the community because there are 2 or 3 people who are those kind of chronic overachievers, and so they actually had to bring in someone from 500 miles away or farther to come and facilitate the community through that session. But then again, that's yet another issue, is, you know, how you flag people even before they get in the community. But, you know, it's always better to try to stave it off ahead of time. So in our place, what we do is things don't come raw to the community. They may originate in the community, but as an idea, but then it gets meted out to one of the various teams, and so they do all the heavy lifting at the team level, and then comes back to the community after it's been thought it's ready for prime time, and then we have like 3 readings of a decision that has to happen. So we have ample opportunity for things to get resolved. You know, co-housing is definitely not if you want a decision right now, co-housing is not the place for you.
Somebody had a logistical question. We have a large group, so we use a microphone. That's useful because it acts as a talking stick, but the downside is that it's hard to move the mic around without a runner. Do you have any ideas for them, or just comments in general about using a microphone at meetings or using a talking stick to make sure everybody feels like they're heard?
I've used talking sticks, and they're you know, as I mentioned, I do this cultural competency and diversity training and stuff, and so sometimes people will want to kind of have that feeling of being indigenous or whatever that is, and they'll have a talking stick that they'll use to go around the room, and I think it's a useful tool. We don't really use that in our community, but I've used it in other groups, or other groups have suggested talking sticks. And even, you know, one of the exercises, I've been in these groups where, you know, they make a talking stick out of from one of their group activities and pass this talking stick around. But as far as the microphone, you know, if you use a stick mic that's on a wire, you know, that's always going to be cumbersome. I mean, you see even Ellen DeGeneres and Oprah wandering around their audiences, and they're fumbling around with this microphone. And so it's not, you know, it's just kind of a clumsy tool to use. And so, you know, lots of options. You could go with the wireless microphone, and that way you don't have the cables, and you can have multiple microphones to resolve that issue. As you know, like if you go to a conference or go to a meeting or something, you'll have the microphones and the audience, you'll have the microphone on stage. But I don't know. It's always going to be, just because you have a tool. Any kind of time you have to introduce tools to your facilitations, it kind of takes makes them a little bit unnatural.
It looks like the folks at Pioneer Valley Co-Housing, they said one of the strategies they use is they invested in everyone being trained in facilitation, whether or not they actually serve as facilitators, but at the very least, everyone knows how to be a more effective meeting member. They invested in a few different training weekends in the early years, both before they moved in and once they were there.
Yeah, that's a good idea. In fact, as I mentioned, everybody thinks, facilitation is facilitation, but it's not. And you may be a great facilitator at dealing with wherever you're working in the government or in software management or whatever. You're really a great facilitator in that realm. But when you get thrust into dealing with herding cats in a co-housing community, then it's just a totally different animal. Same basic kind of tenets, I suppose, but it's just a different skill set of patients, I think, mostly. But yeah, I agree with that. That's a good idea. But oftentimes, people just don't see that as an important thing. And, the social capital part is kind of left to the breeze until, the countertops are picked and the number of swing sets get picked and all that sort of stuff. In the meantime, you made all the decisions about how to spend the money, but how the people get along is something that gets left in the back burner, which is too bad, because the thing is that we talk about co-housing professionals, like the work that I do and the work that Karen Gimnick does and the others. We're over here waiting. We're over here doing whatever, but it's always picking up the pieces. It's always getting people out of jams. And in the meantime, your people are building their homes and building their buying land and all that stuff. And that's where all the resources goes, is to that. When really co-housing is about people. Houses are houses, and it's the co-housing secret sauce is what makes what we do and where we live, what it is. In fact, I've got this other thing going on where how do we pour co-housing secret sauce over any living configuration? So can't build it fast enough.
Well, maybe that's a topic for another web chat. Looks like we have one more question and then we'll wrap it up. David says, how to balance unexperienced and experience maybe of amateur facilitator or professional facilitator, so that the professionals do not get exploited if called on by another community.
I'm trying to interpret what that means.
David, that's you. You can unmute yourself. Is that you? How come I can't unmute you? There you are.
Yes, I was thinking that in co-housing, we tend to be want to be self-helping each other one way or another to try and figure out how to organize ourselves. And I'm thinking in this case, we call on a facilitator from another community. I mean, one of my neighboring communities, two of them have professional facilitators. I mean, they'd be the obvious people to call in. But how to balance whether if we just call them in if they weren't professional, they'd just be amateurs to help us out. But if they're coming in as professionals, then it's how to avoid the exploitation if they're not fully recompensed for their professional work. Whereas amateurs would be just volunteering to help the community, that would be their big contribution. You follow what I'm trying to get at?
Alan, if you could hear David and grasped what he was asking, can you just repeat the question?
Alan? Is that on here?
Well, you know, I didn't actually, it was kind of muted. I didn't get all of it. But I'm reading what he writes here about balancing amateur facilitators or professional facilitators so that professionals do not get exploited if called upon by other communities. Well, you know, I'll just talk just sort of more generally about use of rather than calling them professional, I'll talk about experienced facilitators. And like, for instance, in our community, I'd say we have at least a couple of facilitators who are very experienced facilitators. And, you know, we go off and do facilitations other places and do this kind of stuff for other groups. And so I think it's important for the people who are more experienced to, you know, maybe even offer up their services or offer up their expertise to help others in the community learn how to do it or do it better. But then again, it gets down to like what was talked about at Pioneer Valley, that there has to be this sort of buy-in from the community that this is something that you see as being important. And I would say most communities don't see it as anything that's really important, because apparently everyone's getting through their meetings, everybody's having you know, success running the business of their co-housing communities. So it may not be a problem, but what I offer is just some ideas for you to help make your facilitator skills, you know, maybe a little bit kick it up a notch, or think about something that when you run into a situation in a facilitation, how you might react. It's all, you know, it's all about this sort of visualization as well too. I'll have something happen in a meeting, or I'll see something happen in a meeting, and I'll wonder to myself, okay, how would I deal with that? Or what might have that facilitator done to improve the outcome? And so it's this sort of mindset of facilitation, and it's really kind of, you know, like coaching a little kid soccer team or coaching a little kid basketball team or whatever. It's all about scenarios. It's all about situations, and how to react during a situation. And the more situations you experience, the better facilitator you'll be.
All right, well, it is time to wrap it up. Alan, did you want to leave everybody with any final quick words?
No, other than I'm glad we have like 35 people who signed up for this, and that's from all over the world, and so that's really kind of cool. And also, again, what Karen was talking about, support Cohousing USA. This is one of those things that doesn't cost you to show up, and one of the benefits that we provide, and we have this Giving Tuesday thing going, and if you give $1, it's really worth $2. So
Yep.
give up that latte next week and donate it to Cohousing.
That'd be great. I'll put the link in the chat for that. And then, Alan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I just want to let everybody know that the next web chat is scheduled on Tuesday, January 8th. 6 p.m. Pacific, and then, you know, through the various time zones. Ronnie Rosenbaum, who is a facilitator and lives in Harmony Village in Golden, Colorado, will be talking about improving communication. So on the Cohousing website is a logo for the web chats, and if you click on that, it'll go to the schedule. Also, any web chats that have happened, the recording will be available. This one will be available in the next couple of days, as well as any documents or slides. Okay, and I think that that's it for tonight. Thank you, everybody.